there is a small metal object that makes the exact same distinctive sound anywhere on Earth. A sharp, double click that most people can identify with their eyes closed, without ever having owned one themselves. It has been carried across the battlefields of the Second World War, to the summit of Mount Everest, and into the pockets of soldiers, movie stars, and ordinary smokers for more than 90 years, and it is still manufactured today, largely unchanged in its core mechanical design, in the same small Pennsylvania town where one man built it during the depths of the Great Depression. The company behind it never merged into a conglomerate. It never filed for bankruptcy. It never moved its factory somewhere cheaper, or sold its name to a distant corporate parent, the way nearly every other company in this history eventually did. It is still privately owned today by descendants of the same family that started it, and it still backs every single unit with a guarantee that has not meaningfully changed since the 1930s. This is not, like so many of the companies covered so far, a story about a rise and then a fall. A founder's vision undone by conglomerates or bankruptcy courts decades later. It is a story about something considerably rarer in this history. A small manufacturer that simply kept doing one thing extremely well, in one town, under one family, for one uninterrupted century. This is the story of George Blaisdell and the Zippo lighter. George Grant Blaisdell was born on June 5, 1895, in Bradford, Pennsylvania, a small town tucked into the Allegheny Mountains near the New York state line that had grown up almost entirely around the oil boom of the late 19th century, when the surrounding hills briefly made the region one of the most productive oil-producing areas anywhere in the world, and the town never quite lost the rough, practical, hands-on character that boom had given it, even after the biggest oil money had largely moved on to other fields elsewhere. He did not take to formal education in any conventional sense, and the exact shape of his schooling remains one of the small unresolved mysteries of his early life. Accounts of exactly how far he got vary somewhat between different family and company histories, but by most tellings, he walked out of school as a boy well before finishing anything resembling a complete education, hated the experience enough that his family eventually sent him to a military academy instead, hoping the discipline and structure might succeed where ordinary schooling had already failed to hold his attention, where he lasted roughly 2 years before being dismissed for reasons nobody in his family ever fully explained afterward, a mystery that followed him quietly for the rest of his life, without ever being publicly resolved by anyone who might have known the real story. What he had instead of a diploma was his father's own business, the Blaisdell Machinery Company, where young George started working as a machinist at just 16 years old, putting in 56-hour weeks for 10 cents an hour under conditions that would strike most modern readers as brutal and absorbing without necessarily realizing it at the time, exactly the kind of precision metalworking skill, shop floor instinct, and hands-on familiarity with small mechanical parts that would matter enormously 2 decades later in a business he could not yet have possibly imagined for himself. By 20 years old, he had taken over the family business outright from his father, kept it running through government contracts during the First World War, at a moment when so many smaller, less connected machine shops folded without that kind of steady wartime demand to lean on, and sold the whole operation in 1920 to try his hand at something else entirely, restless in exactly the way that would end up defining the rest of his unusual career. What followed was, by his own later admission, a genuinely rough stretch of years that gave no hint of the success waiting on the other side of it. Blaisdell headed for New York City hoping to make his fortune playing the stock market, chasing the kind of speculative windfall that seemed to be lifting so many ordinary men into sudden wealth during the 1920s. Failed to strike it rich despite his efforts, and returned home to Bradford considerably poorer than when he had left. Whatever confidence he had carried east apparently spent along with his money. He and his brother Walter put what money remained into local oil wells through a partnership they called the Blaisdell Oil Company, drilling and operating in the same hills around Bradford that had already made and lost fortunes for other men for decades before either of them ever got involved. And the two brothers scraped together a modest but reliable living from those wells through most of the 1920s, a far cry from the Wall Street fortune George had originally gone looking for in New York, but steady enough income to keep the family afloat, while whatever his next real idea might turn out to be continued to elude him for years. By the early 1930s, in the depths of the Depression, With oil income shrinking along with everything else in the American economy, he was still a man without a clear direction or a defining project of his own, waiting, by his own later account, for the right idea to simply present itself, with no particular reason to believe one was coming. It arrived on the porch of the Bradford Country Club sometime in 1932, in a conversation so ordinary that neither man involved could have suspected anything would come of it. Blaisdell was smoking with a local businessman named Dick Dresser, who was using an odd, clumsy-looking lighter to light his cigarette, a windproof design imported from Austria that took both hands and considerable fumbling to operate reliably. Blaisdell, watching him struggle with it, asked why he bothered with something so ungainly when simpler lighters were readily available. Dresser's answer was simple, and as it turned out, genuinely consequential for reasons neither man could have guessed standing on that porch. Well, it works. That plain, almost dismissive endorsement was enough for Blaisdell, whose entire adult life to that point had already shown a repeating pattern of chasing whatever idea happened to catch his restless attention next, whether it was a machine shop, a stock market fortune, or a partnership in oil wells. He tracked down the rights to the Austrian design, brought it back to Bradford, and set about redesigning it entirely, using the machining instincts he had picked up as a teenager in his father's shop 2 decades earlier, instincts that had been sitting mostly idle through his failed Wall Street venture and his years pumping oil. He reshaped the case into a rectangular block, rather than the original's rounder, less pocket-friendly profile, added a hinged lid that let a user open, light, and close the whole thing with one hand, rather than the Austrian original's clumsier two-handed operation that had so annoyed Blaisdell watching Dresser fumble with it, and, most importantly, reworked the windproofing mechanism itself into something genuinely new. A metal chimney surrounding the wick, perforated with a precise pattern of small holes positioned to let just enough oxygen reach the flame, while physically deflecting the gusts of wind that would snuff out an ordinary open flame in seconds. He liked the modern mechanical sound of the word zipper, itself still a fairly novel invention at the time, and settled on a name to match, Zippo, a word with no literal connection to what the product actually did, chosen purely because it sounded like the future. The mechanism inside deserves a closer look, because it explains something about the product that most people notice constantly, without ever thinking through why it actually happens. Beneath the hinged lid sits a small cam, a toggle-shaped piece of metal riveted to the top of the lighter's removable insert, pressed against a tensioned leaf spring, running the length of the case beneath it. Opening the lid rotates that cam against the spring's resistance, and once it passes a certain point in its rotation, the spring's built-up tension snaps the lid the rest of the way open on its own, producing the same sharp, distinctive click every single time, regardless of how carefully or how carelessly the lid happens to be flicked open by whoever is holding it. That same mechanism snaps it shut again just as decisively when closed, which is precisely why a Zippo makes an identical, unmistakable sound, whether it is opened by a soldier in a foxhole in 1943 or by a customer standing at a retail counter today. The exact same 2 pieces of tension metal doing the exact same job they were designed to do generations apart. It was never marketed or designed as a signature sound in its own right. It fell directly out of a purely mechanical solution to a much more mundane engineering problem, keeping a hinged metal lid securely open or securely closed under everyday handling. And popular culture simply built an entire identity around the accidental acoustic byproduct of that solution over the following decades, until the click itself became as recognizable as the object producing it. Blaisdell obtained his first patent on the design on March 3, 1936, several years after the first Zippo lighters had already gone on sale. In 1933, the patent filing trailing well behind the actual commercial launch in a way that suggests Blaisdell was more focused on getting the product into people's hands than on protecting it legally in those earliest years. Growth in that early stretch was modest and entirely local at first, the kind of slow, word-of-mouth expansion that gave no obvious sign of the global reach the product would eventually achieve. One of the company's first meaningful bulk orders came from the Kendall Refining Company, a fellow Bradford business that presumably knew Blaisdell personally, or at least knew of his family's long standing in the town from his father's machine shop days, which placed an order for 500 lighters in the mid-1930s, the kind of small, local, almost neighborly transaction that kept the young company financially afloat, while it slowly built a wider reputation beyond its own hometown, and beyond the small circle of people who already knew and trusted the Blaisdell name personally. The promise that did more than any single sale to build that wider reputation was Blaisdell's guarantee, eventually distilled into 4 simple words that the company still uses today, printed and repeated for nearly a century: "It works, or we fix it free." In the middle of the Great Depression, when consumers had every practical reason to distrust a brand new manufacturer's promises about a product nobody had heard of before, an unconditional, permanent, no questions asked repair guarantee on an everyday consumer item was a genuinely bold, almost reckless-sounding thing for a small company to offer. It worked exactly the way Blaisdell apparently hoped it would, generating precisely the kind of word-of-mouth trust that no advertising budget available to a small Pennsylvania manufacturer in the 1930s could ever have purchased outright, turning every satisfied repair into an unpaid advertisement carried by the customer themselves. The Second World War transformed Zippo from a regional novelty into a genuine national institution, and it happened through a decision that, in the moment, must have looked almost like giving up the civilian market entirely, at the exact point the company most needed to be building it. Once the United States entered the war, Zippo redirected its entire production output to the American military and stopped selling to ordinary civilian customers altogether for the full duration of the conflict, an all-or-nothing wartime pivot considerably more complete than most manufacturers in this history ever attempted, many of whom kept at least some civilian product moving alongside their war contracts. Soldiers carried Zippos onto battlefields across Europe and the Pacific, into foxholes, aboard ships, and even into prisoner of war camps. And the lighter's reputation for surviving mud, salt water, and rough daily handling while still lighting reliably on the first strike spread through the ranks entirely on its own, through nothing more than one soldier showing another soldier that the thing simply worked, without a single wartime advertisement aimed at a civilian audience who could not have bought one even if they had wanted to. When those same soldiers came home at the end of the war, they brought a genuine battle-tested brand loyalty with them that no peacetime marketing campaign could ever have manufactured from scratch on its own. And Zippo emerged from a war in which it had sold literally nothing at all to ordinary Americans as one of the most trusted and recognizable names in the entire country. An almost paradoxical outcome for a company that had spent 4 consecutive years turning away every civilian dollar offered to it. Blaisdell never lost his sense of where the company's fortune had actually come from, and he made a point of demonstrating that loyalty in ways that went well beyond simple sentiment. He engraved the words Bradford, Pennsylvania on the bottom of every single lighter the company produced, a small, permanent physical statement of civic loyalty stamped into millions upon millions of pieces of metal shipped to every corner of the world, meaning a soldier in the Pacific or a customer in post-war Europe would find the name of a small Allegheny mountain town on the object in their pocket, whether they had ever heard of the place or not. In the 1940s, he personally built and maintained a ski slope for the town's residents, a genuine amenity for ordinary working families, rather than any kind of corporate publicity stunt, and he remained closely and personally involved in Bradford civic life for the rest of his own career, reportedly telling people plainly and directly that without the people of that town, there would have been no Zippo at all, and that Zippo would always support Bradford and its surrounding communities in return for what the town had given the company in its earliest, most uncertain years. It was a rare kind of loyalty for a manufacturer whose product, by the middle of the 20th century, was recognized on nearly every continent on Earth, the kind of company that, in this history, more often relocates its headquarters the moment a larger city or a cheaper tax rate beckons, rather than staying rooted in the small town where it began. Most pocket lighters on the market before Zippo's arrival had been, by the standards later observers would apply, poorly designed, not reliably windproof, awkward to operate one-handed, and generally regarded as more of a passing novelty than a genuinely practical daily tool. Zippo's combination of a comfortable rectangular shape, a hinged lid built for one-handed use, and above all, its windproof chimney set an entirely new baseline for what a pocket lighter was expected to do, and rival manufacturers spent the following decades trying to match it, developing their own windproof designs and steadily improving their own build quality simply to keep pace with the standard Blaisdell's small Bradford company had unexpectedly set for the entire industry. The rest of the mechanism is worth understanding too, since it explains why a Zippo behaves so differently from the disposable butane lighters that eventually came to dominate the broader market decades later. Inside the removable metal insert sits a packing of cotton or fiberglass material that acts essentially as a small sponge, soaking up and holding naphtha-based lighter fluid the way an old-fashioned oil lamp's wick reservoir holds its own fuel. A braided wick, often woven around a thin copper wire core to help it stand upright inside the chimney, runs up from that saturated packing into the base of the metal chimney itself, drawing fuel upward through simple capillary action rather than any pump, cartridge, or pressurized valve of the kind later disposable lighters would rely on. And a small flint wheel mounted just below the wick strikes sparks against a replaceable flint rod every time it is spun by a thumb, igniting the vapor rising continuously off the fuel-soaked packing beneath it. It is a fundamentally different, considerably older approach to making fire than the pressurized butane lighters that eventually became the disposable, throwaway norm across most of the world, closer in spirit to a traditional oil lamp than to a modern gas lighter. And it is precisely that older, simpler, more mechanical approach that lets a Zippo be refueled, reflinted, and rewicked indefinitely rather than discarded once its contents run out. That single design choice, favoring a refillable, hand-serviceable mechanism over a sealed, disposable one, sits at the very heart of why the lifetime guarantee was even possible to offer in the first place. There was, by design, almost nothing inside a Zippo that a trained technician could not eventually take apart, repair, or replace by hand, which is exactly the quiet mechanical logic that has kept the company's original forward promise financially sustainable for nearly a century, rather than collapsing under its own generosity, the way a more complex or more disposable design almost certainly would have. The lighter's reputation only grew from there over the following decades, carried well beyond its original practical purpose by popular culture in ways Blaisdell himself could hardly have anticipated back on that country club porch in 1932. It has appeared in the hands of movie stars and in the backdrop of countless films, been carried to the summit of Mount Everest, and become, by the plain testimony of the company's own decades of repair requests, the kind of object people hold on to and pass down through a family, rather than replace. A small piece of durable, single-purpose machinery, surviving in a consumer culture that increasingly organizes itself around the opposite instinct entirely: planned obsolescence and disposability as the default assumption behind nearly every manufactured object. George Blaisdell died on October 3, 1978, at 83 years old, having led the company he founded for almost the entire span of its existence up to that point, from a single redesigned Austrian lighter on a Depression-era workbench to a globally recognized brand. Ownership passed to his two daughters, Sarah Blaisdell Dorn and Harriet Blaisdell Wick, an unusually direct transfer of control to women in an era when most American manufacturing companies of comparable size still assume male heirs, sons-in-law, or outside professional managers would naturally take charge instead, and the family kept ownership concentrated tightly among themselves through the following decades rather than diluting it through a public stock offering or an outside sale. The company diversified only cautiously and slowly beyond its core product, resisting the kind of aggressive, unrelated expansion that had swallowed so many other family businesses covered in this history. A pocket tape measure introduced in 1962 marked its first venture outside lighters at all, a modest and closely related step rather than a leap into an entirely foreign industry. It was not until 1993 that Zippo made its next major move, acquiring the WWII Case & Sons Cutlery Company, itself a venerable American knife maker founded back in 1889 that had relocated to Bradford in 1905, meaning Zippo's biggest single acquisition in its entire corporate history was, fittingly and almost poetically, another historic manufacturer from the very same small town that had raised its own founder. In 1997, the company opened a combined Zippo and Case museum in Bradford, a 15,000 square foot facility including a retail store and a public repair clinic where visitors can watch the company's own technicians perform free lifetime repairs on decades-old lighters in real time, disassembling and rebuilding lighters that are sometimes older than the customer standing at the counter waiting for them. The exact same guarantee Blaisdell had first offered back in the 1930s, still being honored in person, in the same small town, generations after the man who made the promise had died, and long after any ordinary business might have quietly let such an expensive, open-ended commitment lapse. Control of the company eventually passed further still to George B. Duke, Blaisdell's own grandson, who became sole owner and chairman of the board, keeping direct family ownership intact across 3 full generations without the company ever going public, ever merging with an outside conglomerate, or ever relocating its manufacturing operations away from Bradford the way so many comparably successful American manufacturers eventually did, in search of cheaper labor or friendlier tax jurisdictions elsewhere. Every classic Zippo lighter sold today is still made in that same small town, using a core mechanical design: the rectangular case, the hinged lid, the perforated windproof chimney, the cam and spring click that has remained essentially unchanged since the 1930s. Even as the company layered modern finishes, licensed designs, and limited edition collaborations around that unchanging mechanical core underneath. A standard Zippo today is built from 22 distinct parts across roughly 108 separate manufacturing operations. A surprisingly intricate precision production process, hidden behind an object simple enough in its final form that most owners never think to ask how many individual steps it actually takes to make one small metal lighter. In 2012, the company produced its 500 millionth lighter, a single running count stretching back unbroken to that first commercial sale in 1933. And Zippo products are now distributed in more than 150 countries around the entire world, an almost unimaginable global reach for a company that started with one machinist's son redesigning a stranger's lighter on a hunch. There is no dramatic ending to this particular story, no bankruptcy filing, no hostile takeover, no conglomerate quietly absorbing the name into a portfolio of unrelated businesses. The way so many other companies in this history eventually experienced somewhere along the way, and no forgotten factory eventually converted into a museum or a medical office as the very last physical trace of a business that finally stopped existing under its own name. George Blaisdell's family still owns the company he built out of a chance conversation on a country club porch back in 1932. The guarantee he made in the depths of the Depression is still honored today, exactly as originally written. 4 simple words that have already outlived their author by nearly half a century and show no sign of being retired anytime soon. And the name engraved into the bottom of every single lighter still reads the same small Pennsylvania town it always has since the very beginning. In an industrial history built largely out of mergers, dissolutions, forgotten names, and factories quietly repurposed into something else entirely. Once their original business finally gave out, Zippo stands out simply for having refused to become any of those things, staying instead almost exactly what one restless machinist's son built it to be on a hunch during the worst economic downturn of the entire 20th century. Click after identical click, for more than 90 uninterrupted years and counting.